Hello and welcome to another Literacy Ready training refresher. This training refresher will focus on the English unit from the Literacy Ready course, specifically English Unit 2, and I'm going to provide some information about facilitating a whole class discussion. This information certainly can be applied to English Unit 2. It also can be applied to other areas of your instruction where you are facilitating a whole class discussion. So the first question we want to talk about is how whole class discussion is situated within Unit 2. And this, as I said before, is pretty much throughout the unit. Whole class discussion starts in Lesson 2 and continues throughout students' reading of the novel. And usually the whole class discussion is focused on work that students have done in their reading and research log, where they have been asked to develop Level 1 and Level 2 questions. And often the whole class discussion will involve choosing one or two of those discussion questions and using those to discuss the novel. So as an former English teacher myself, I often found that whole class discussion was one of the more difficult things that I had to do as an English teacher. I don't know if this is your experience as well, but for many years I've been collecting information about how to do discussions better, trying those out with my own classes, and just working on that sort of knowledge base and skill of facilitating whole class discussion. This has led me to believe that much of the success of whole class discussions depends on several things. Number one, your students have to be prepared for participation in the discussion. That means they need to have some knowledge. They need to have read the material. They need to have actually done their reading and research logs. And so they need to have something to say, and that's where their preparation comes in. Your students also, their experience with participation in a whole class discussion also has a role to play. So if they have not been in the past participating in whole class discussions, either in English classes or in other classes, often this will be difficult to facilitate. If they're used to just doing seat work, not really talking in class, then it makes it more difficult. If they have more experience with participation, that makes it easier. And finally, the success of the whole class discussion depends also on your comfort level and experience with whole class discussion. So if as a teacher you have a lot of experience with facilitating whole class discussions and you're pretty comfortable with it, then that is going to make a difference. So just remember going through this that you and your students can get better at whole class discussion with practice and feedback. There are some things that you can do as a teacher to facilitate whole class discussion before it even starts. And those things include helping your students be aware of discussion norms, moving the physical environment around so it works best for a whole class discussion, doing some prep work, both in terms of having your students do some prep work and you doing some prep work, and then thinking through the structure that you choose to use. So in terms of discussion norms, particularly for classes or students who have not had much experience in whole class discussion, you may want to work with your students to set up some norms. Now, I am not personally in favor of the kind of norm where the teacher asks a question and students raise their hand and respond. What I would like to see instead is students regulating their own involvement in the discussion. That may take some time and experience, but perhaps you might say to students, I am not going to be the facilitator. You all are going to be facilitating your own discussion. And so that means you're not going to be raising your hand to be called on. You'll be waiting for an opportune time to inject your voice into the conversation. Now that means, that discussion norm means that both the person who wants to speak and the person who is currently speaking need to have some awareness of what's going on around them. So students who are consistently talking and not allowing others to speak need to get the feedback that they should invite others into the conversation. Those who never say anything need to get the feedback that they should wait for a chance and then inject their voice into the conversation. That's difficult to work on, and it takes practice and it takes feedback. But remember that telling your students that this is what we're aiming for, where you will all be talking with each other and I can inject my voice as well, but that you should be participating in a whole class discussion as a whole class, not just back and forth with the teacher. Now, in terms of the physical environment, it's best if students can face each other so that they can see if someone has something to put into the conversation. So I've often done that with a big circle. That also depends on the structure that you choose to use for your discussion, and I'll talk more about that later. But certainly arranging desks or chairs so that students can see each other is important. It doesn't have to be a single circle. Maybe it's circles of desks with lines so that there are rows of people. That is a little problematic in the sense that the one who's on the inside row, his or her back is turned to the ones behind them. So it's a little tricky, I know, with classroom space. So you have to do the best you can with the physical environment. In terms of prep work, this is where you're asking students to come to the discussion with some information. Maybe in the case of this unit, we're asking students to do their reading and research log and have their reading done before they come to the discussion. In another unit, you may ask students to have the answers to particular questions, to have collected information about a certain topic from their reading. They may do that individually, they may do that in a small group or with a partner. So just making sure that they have something ready to contribute to the discussion at hand is important. Then in terms of thinking through the structure that you choose to use, this can be one of many different kinds. And I'm going to show you some resources where you can get information about different structures. Those that I've used successfully in my classroom include a Socratic seminar. We've also used a fishbowl discussion, where you have a smaller group of students who are discussing and then the rest of the class is observing. You may want to have the discussion go from partners to small groups and then to the whole class, but just thinking through your own experience, your own comfort level, your students' experience and comfort level, and then setting up a structure that will work for them is pretty important. So, as I mentioned before, structuring a whole class discussion is very important. Just having an idea ahead of time about how the students will be seated, what will be the focus, and what will be the outcome of the discussion. So I mentioned two possible structures, a Socratic seminar and a fishbowl. And I'm going to provide you at the end of this video some information that you can get for those two structures. Basically, a Socratic seminar involves, I've seen it many different ways. One way that you can do it is to have an inner circle of students who are prepared to discuss a particular topic, an outer circle, which is those students' coaches. So there'll be the inner circle of speakers, the outer circle of coaches, and then the teacher is really not in the discussion except to get it started. And then usually this will run for maybe 10 minutes. And then there's a break for the coaches to meet with their partners to say, here's what you should do, here's what you might say, be sure you invite other people into the conversation, etc. There are a lot of videos that you can find that show different structures for Socratic seminar. A fishbowl discussion is really where you have a smaller group who the participants of that smaller group are in the inner circle, maybe 5-6 students, and then they are participating in a discussion. And the rest of the class is sitting on the outside and watching. Now, I've seen this done in several different ways. One way that I think would really work is to have the students who are in the inside of the fishbowl representing a small group. That small group has worked together to provide information to the speaker. The speaker then goes and represents the small group in the fishbowl while the rest of the class watches. And then, of course, there can be opportunities for different members of each group to tap out the one who's the speaker and become the speaker themselves. As I mentioned before, you can also practice some flow, working with students as pairs, then to small groups, then to the whole class. That's really helpful for students who are not as comfortable speaking in the whole class. At least then they get the opportunity to speak with their whole group. It's really important to remember that whoever's doing the speaking is the one doing the learning. And so we want our students to be speaking and talking with each other about the ideas that you're discussing. If they're not comfortable in the whole class setting, then at least they can be doing that in their small group. Another important issue for whole class discussion is the use of authentic questions. Now, this is a term I don't really like very much, but it gets at questions that people can reasonably disagree on the answer. So it wouldn't be a question that just everyone knows the answer to, or a question that is very black and white in terms of the answer, but rather one that reasonable people will disagree on, and that there is evidence for either side, or the many sides that might be answered in the question. So another term that I like to use with these authentic questions is uptake. So this is the opportunity that you as the teacher, or your students as the discussants here, have to ask probing questions, to take what someone has said and respond to it. So that's a really important part of learning to discuss, is learning to practice uptake. And it's something that I think comes with practice and feedback. It may not happen automatically, but it's the opportunity for students to say, oh, I hear what John is saying, and I agree with this part of it, but I disagree about this part of it, and here's my reason why. So there's an actual response and a give and take happening there. And then in terms of probes, as I said before, this is an opportunity to just ask probing questions. They can come from the teacher, they can come from other students, but just to dig a little bit deeper. The kind of probing questions that I like to use is just to say, tell me a little more about, or can you refer to the text and tell me where you found that? And so it asks students to really provide more information. So basically, with whole class discussion, we have to improve through practice and feedback, not only on the content of the discussion, but also the skills being used by the students in the discussion. And here's where you as a teacher really have to encourage students to talk to each other, not just back and forth between you and the students. So, some important ideas just as a recap for facilitating whole class discussion. First, make sure you have good, authentic questions. Now, in the discussions for Unit 2, the questions should come from students Level 1 and Level 2 questions on their reading and research logs. Here you can ask the students as a whole class or as small groups to bring forward what they see as the best authentic questions. And defining that term best really will help to get better questions out of them. It's very possible that at the beginning their questions will not be very helpful or useful. They may be too cut and dried, they may be too extreme or too simple. So working with students to develop really good questions is an important part of this discussion. As I said, making sure students have something to contribute is important. They need to have done that work ahead of time to have some material to bring to the discussion. And then flow through this idea of starting with the individual, maybe with the work they've done already, moving into partners and small groups and the whole class, and then maybe back to the individual. A nice way to wrap up a whole class discussion might be to have students write either an evaluation of their own performance in the discussion, or perhaps a couple of sentences about what they learned through the discussion, or something like that. We have to teach students to practice uptake, bringing others into the discussion, learning to disagree and agree, providing evidence. And that's something you can do often through goal setting at the beginning of the discussion. So say, set yourself a goal, write it down. I want to improve in my discussion skills by bringing at least 2 people into the discussion who have not yet participated. And then at the end, giving them some time to evaluate how well they did in their goals. And then also you as the teacher providing feedback on their discussion content and their discussion skills. So that feedback might come in the way of a whole class discussion about how the discussion went. Also, you can certainly use the rubrics that we provide in the unit for discussion to provide that feedback. So here's the rubric itself. If you'll notice, we used the only a small slice of the Common Core State Standards for speaking and listening for this rubric. But you can see that in general, we're focusing on that the students come to class prepared for discussion, and they bring evidence from the text into the discussion, and then that they pose and respond to questions that make connections among the text and the world. So this is a nice way to provide a little bit of feedback for students on their participation in the discussion. In addition, you might have students do that individual goal setting thing where they can do some self-evaluation of their own participation. So I mentioned that I was going to provide some resources, and this is the first of those. This website, teachingchannel.org, has an amazing number of videos related to instruction in all different content areas, all different grade levels. So what I would recommend is that you use this search bar here and do a search for Socratic seminar, discussion, etc. There are maybe 5 or 6 videos for Socratic seminar in English classes, and there are several other whole class discussion kinds of structures where there are videos. And the videos are very helpful. They include shots from classrooms as well as individual shots of the teacher talking about her lessons and how she presents this kind of information. Really great stuff on the Teaching Channel website. This resource is a blog post from edutopia.org. It's called Rethinking Whole Class Discussion, and it's by Todd Finley. This particular blog provides a lot of information about whole class discussion that may be really helpful for you. So I'd really encourage you to take a look at it. Again, the title is Rethinking Whole Class Discussion, and it's by Todd Finley. So what you'll find on this website is that he provides a lot of different alternatives, links to different sources for whole class discussion, some sort of before you get started tips and while you're going on tips. Very helpful stuff here for whole class discussion. And finally, particularly for English language arts classrooms, is this book. It's called Inspiring Dialogue, Talking to Learn in the English Classroom. I use this in my own classes where I'm working with pre-service English teachers. And it basically walks you through kind of the theory behind using dialogue in the classroom, or what these authors call dialogic pedagogy. And then it provides a lot of different tools that teachers can use to make sure that students are talking to each other, some helpful tips on how to handle problems, which always emerge. And then the last part of the book is how to use dialogic pedagogy, or just teaching for student voices, as a way of examining your own instruction to make sure that you're doing a good job in the classroom, particularly with inspiring students to talk for learning. So that's what we have for today in terms of whole class discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I wish you all the best. Thanks.